Welcome to What's Going On, the weekly podcast and videocast of First United Methodist Church in Yankton, South Dakota. Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of What's Going On. I'm Pastor Katie here at First United Methodist, and I'm glad you could join me for this episode. I want to do just a few quick housekeeping things before we dive into our topic for today. This coming Sunday is the launch of our new modern worship service called The Living Light, and I'm very excited to be launching this. And I look forward to the ways in which God can use this new service. So that's going to be Sunday at 5:30 p.m. here at the church. One of the things that I'm hoping for and looking for is a regular schedule of volunteers for this service. The volunteers would include greeters, ushers, and eventually I would like to get fellowship in place for that service as well. That leads me to the next thing I want to talk about, which is that fellowship coordinator volunteer position is still open, and I'm still waiting for the right person to come forward to say that God is leading them to coordinate that. And if that is you, I pray that you would come and visit with me about what that would look like and how you can serve the church in that way. Monday is United Women in Faith, and their program will be the Servant Hearts Clinic here in Yankton. It's a free clinic on Monday nights, and it's operated on a volunteer basis. And I am part of the board of that organization and feel very strongly about the work that they do and the mission that they serve in helping to care and heal people without any cost. And it's pretty incredible. So that'll be Monday at 1:30 in the lounge. I will be out of the office next week, Monday through Wednesday, for Clergy Leadership Academy. I'm helping to host that this year. And so the office will still be open. You can still get a hold of me if you need to through email or text or calling. If I am unable to take the call, I will call you back when I am able to. And this will be the last of my trips for work until annual conference in June. So I'm looking to be done. It feels like I've been gone a lot this winter, but all for good things. But just to give you that heads up. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? Well, one of the things I get to do in the church is teach confirmation, which is actually one of my great joys. I came out of youth ministry, I came out of camping ministry, and confirmation is kind of the one thing left that I do and get to have time with the youth of our church. And so I hold on to that very strongly and very dearly. That's something that I want to be a part of and something I want to do. And last night at confirmation, we were talking, the lesson was around a call to follow. And it was a really good discussion and a really good lesson. And it made me feel like we should talk about it here as well. One of the comments that was made by one of the mentors is that they feel like they're getting more out of confirmation than the student that they're mentoring. And they made the comment that maybe we should have confirmation for adults. And I don't think that's a terrible idea. So that might be something to bring up to whoever comes next, that is something of interest. But we were talking about this idea of God's calling, how it can look different, and also sometimes the cost of answering that call, which definitely flows into the book that we just finished for Pastor Book Club, The Cost of Discipleship. It also was the students connected it to the sermon I did on Ash Wednesday, and so that was a very proud moment for me as a pastor, that one of my students went, "That's like what you said in your sermon." I'm like, oh my gosh, like they remembered the sermon and they connected it, and that's really cool. And so we started by exploring a story in the book of Acts following Saul and his experience on the road to Damascus. And so if you're unfamiliar with that, let me just recap it for you. So Saul in the New Testament, Saul, not King Saul of the Old Testament, in the New Testament, Saul was a persecutor of Christians. He, on the authority of the chief priests, would get these letters and then go into communities where there were these Jewish Christians that were meeting and following the ways of Christ, known as the Way. And he would take them and arrest them and take them to Jerusalem to be tried for basically heresy. He did a lot in Jerusalem around that work, but he was heading out to Damascus next. And he had quite the reputation that people who were following Jesus in those early days, especially the Jews that were following Jesus, knew of Saul and knew of kind of his particular zeal to rid Judaism of this radical sect. That's how he saw it. That's what he thought. He was being incredibly faithful to God and doing this work. And so, as he was traveling, he had gotten papers. He was on his way to the synagogue in Damascus when he encounters God. There is a bright light, and there's a voice that says, why are you persecuting me? And Saul says, who are you? And he says, I'm Jesus, and you are persecuting me. And the people around Saul don't see Jesus. Saul does see Jesus, and then he is blinded by that experience. And they actually have to lead him the rest of the way by hand because he can't see. And so he enters into the town and he's praying and he's like, what is happening? Why did I just have that experience? Meanwhile, in that town, there is a follower of the way named Ananias. And God also gives Ananias a vision of this Saul who is in the town, who is praying. And God is asking Ananias to go to Saul and lay his hands upon Saul so that he might receive his sight. And Ananias is conflicted, to say the least. He knows who Saul is, he is aware of what Saul is doing or is meant to be doing in that town. And he is very conflicted as to why he would have a vision to help this person. But eventually he agrees to do it and he goes and as he lays hands on Saul, something like scales fall from Saul's eyes and he receives his sight and is baptized. And it really is the beginning of Saul's conversion to Christianity. And Saul will eventually have such a complete conversion that he doesn't even go by the name Saul anymore. He'll go by the name of Paul, Paul the Apostle to the Gentiles, Paul who wrote half of the New Testament. And so we compared and contrasted these two men in this same story of the calling that they are receiving, the cost of that call, and what that meant for their lives, and how the people around them understood what was happening. And so we see in Saul, the people around him, even as he's having this profound experience, are not having it in the same way that he is. And I think when he comes out of it, people are, you have the people that he did associate with who now, who they were with him on his tirade against Christians, and now he's saying he's one of them, that they're right. They're like, what are you doing? Like, we're not going to go with you on this. And then you also have the people who he had been persecuting, and now he's like, no, I'm one of you. And I think they're pretty skeptical, as I think any of us would be. And so Saul is really called, Ananias is told that Saul's going to be a great instrument of God, that God has chosen him to be this apostle to the Gentiles and to bring in more and more people to the faith. Ananias is kind of like, are you sure? Are you sure that that's the guy that you want? I mean, he's dedicated his whole life to stamping out this movement, and now he's going to be like the face of it? Like, I don't think so. So you have all these people in Saul's life, either the people he had associated with or the people he had been tormenting, really. None of them are on board with this calling. And I think that would be a really hard thing because he's basically giving up the life he's known. He's given up the belief system he's known. He's giving up his associations, probably his family connections, all of it for the sake of Jesus, ultimately. And I think that's a pretty profound thing that not many of us are really called to. Not many of us are really presented with that sort of divide between their old life and their new life in Christ. But it's pretty all-consuming. Saul is being called to give everything for the sake of Jesus and for the sake of spreading the good news. But then we have Ananias as well. Ananias, we don't hear in this story as someone who's being called to apostleship or someone. We do seem to have a sense that he is a very faithful person, that he is very trusted, that that he will listen to God and obey God even when he doesn't understand. Um, but he is being asked, and I think it's a different type of calling that we see here, which is kind of not only do we have sort of broad callings from God, as Saul does, of like, this is leading toward a lifetime of work, but sometimes God calls us to very specific things. And I think that's what we see with Ananias' story of, I am asking you to do this hard thing. I am asking you to show up in this time, in this place, in this way, and that the people around you are not going to understand and they're not going to support it necessarily. But I need you to trust me. Ananias actually makes me, when I read this story, I think of Nelson Mandela. And the reason I do, there was a movie that came out, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago called Invictus. Great movie. Feel like I've talked about it before. But one of the great things about that movie is the struggle that Mandela faced when he became prime minister in South Africa, of all of the people around him wanted him to seek revenge because of apartheid. I mean, apartheid was an evil thing. And Mandela, I feel like would have been justly, no one would have blamed him, I think, because of the atrocities that the people faced under apartheid. And so he had these people around him that now that he was in a position of power, they wanted him to, mete out justice, right? And Mandela refuses. He refuses to go down that road. And in part of doing that, he's supporting the rugby team in South Africa, that's an all-white rugby team, in a bid to find a place of unity. And I feel like that conversation that Mandela faced, that pressure that Mandela faced, would have been the same kind of pressure that Ananias would have faced of, this is the enemy, and you can't do this. Um, but both Ananias and Mandela have a calling beyond just the immediate to what God is doing, what God is up to, what God can make happen. And that is a big step of faith. And that is, I think, a certain kind of calling. It also connects, in my mind, to the book of Esther in the Old Testament. Esther was put in a specific time, in a specific position, to accomplish something that nobody else could. And so, again, the calling on her life is, again, a calling to a specific thing, that things are leading up to this moment, to this point. I have in my office actually a quote from the book of Esther, which says, perhaps this is the moment for which you have been created. So again, that idea of that sometimes our calling leads us to a specific thing that we are put in a position for. And that kind of, it is that opportunity, that moment of decision, of faith, of, am I going to do what God wants, or am I going to do what I want? Because so often those things are not the same thing. And Esther is told by her uncle, you have an opportunity that nobody else has. And perhaps God put you in this position for this reason. And I think Ananias is in that same boat. I am giving you an opportunity that nobody else has to change the course of history, really, because in changing Saul's life, he becomes Paul, and the church grows exponentially because of what Paul was able to do. But it takes getting out of our own situation, our own viewpoint, our own desires, our own, self-righteousness in order to follow what God is up to. And so we talked a lot about um, the calling and how that looks different. How there are times where, if you ask any pastor, one of the things that all pastors are asked to be able to share is their call story, because we believe if you've not been called by God into ministry in this way, you shouldn't do it. And I fully believe that. I think anybody who goes into ministry for their own purposes, for their own ego, for their own, you know, power or to make their own name great in some way, or, for the money, which is just laughable. Although I will say that I've been very blessed in that way, but um, they shouldn't be in ministry. I think a life of ministry really needs to be centered on the call of God to serve God's people. So every pastor has to be able to articulate some sort of call story of how they believe that God has invited them into this role, into this space, into this uh, calling. So I'm sure you've heard my story. I'm I will share it again because it feels appropriate for this podcast. But I have felt the call. I would say probably for most of my life, although I wasn't open to receiving the call for most of my life as well. So I was pretty young the first time I articulated the possibility of being a pastor, and really at that point it was around the knowledge that pastors helped people, and I felt really like that was a good thing, and that's I wanted to be someone who helped people. But that was in the course of 1 week I was going to be a radio DJ, and 1 week I was going to be an archaeologist until I found out there were bugs in the desert. I was like, oh, never mind, I don't want to do that. Um, it was very much it was in the laundry list of things that I thought I wanted to do with my life. Again, when I was in high school, started to feel I had kind of given my life to Christ and committed to my faith in a way I hadn't before. And then started to feel that nudge, that tug again by my senior year of high school. Even did like shadowing with a youth pastor, but at that point, like it still hadn't really solidified into something. It was just a sense that God was asking something of me, and I either couldn't figure out exactly what that meant, or I couldn't reconcile the idea of who I am and that God would want me for something. And if I'm being honest, I think that's probably more what was going on. But I did go to college with the idea of studying theology, philosophy, religion, that kind of thing. But really thought I would teach. I even had a semester where I was like, no, I can't do this, and was going to be an English teacher. Then I went to seminary. And at that point, like I think I was just circling around the call. Like again, I felt so drawn to God and drawn to these ideas and these topics and having these deep conversations and really wanting to grow my faith, but also just avoiding the plague, the idea of being a pastor. I just really felt like I don't want to do that. I don't want that life. I don't want It felt really limiting to me at the time, my understanding of what a pastor was and what a pastor did. I was like, that's not for me. That's not the life I want. And so like I would kind of go with God to a degree, right? Like I was being pulled, but I was like dragging my feet. I was sticking my heels in going, God, I'll go with you, but not that far. And uh and kind of tried to pick things that were kind of related, but not quite what God was wanting. And it wasn't until I was broke that I got a job as a youth pastor because I couldn't go back to school anymore, which sometimes people use school and graduate school as a way to avoid reality. And I was probably one of them. Uh, and it was there that I, started working in a church and realized ministry fills my heart in a way that nothing else does. And perhaps that God can use me as me for this kind of work because I just really felt like I never fit the mold of what a pastor should be. And so it wasn't until I experienced ministry in that role and kind of realized that God had been leading me here the whole time. And so I finally accepted that call, kind of being overwhelmed at camp one night many moons ago. And and then the way that I sort of checked that because I think it's helpful as well if we are feeling called into something like this, if we are discerning God leading us in that way, is to check with people that you love and trust to say, do you see this as well? Does this make any sense to you? And I'm not saying that that's always the right move because, again, I think the people around Saul would have been like, not the right move. I think people around Ananias probably would have told him the same, but I think there are times where faithful people do see and do have that uh, insight. And so for me, when I kind of was beginning to accept that this is really what God wanted, I started checking with people who I really trusted. And they were of the opinion that this was a no-brainer. And how did I not see it sooner? As I was telling this story in confirmation last night, Diane Kish, who was actually present at the camp that I was having all of these revelations, even she was like, duh, duh, Katie, duh. Uh, I had known Diane for a while at that point. And so she was one of the people that could confirm that in my own life. And so kind of been a full circle moment coming here and getting to work with her in this way. It's been really a blessing. And so uh, and so from that point on, I was able to articulate that and feel confident in that. So that's one way to talk about calling. And I think, that's sort of a Saul style, right? Like this is all in. You are not going to be able to hold back anything. You have to go all in. And as an itinerant pastor, I think that's very real and very true. And that's been coming again very to the to the surface in my life right now, right? This idea of I have given over control of my life to something greater than me and trusting God's guidance and discernment in the itinerancy process, that this is part of the calling that I accepted so long ago. But it really does have impact on my life, on the life of my family. But it's also been the source of the greatest blessings. And so I also shared though that there are other types of callings, and there's other, again, that Saul to Ananias, and Jason had an Ananias moment, I would say. Um, and so I want to share a little bit of his story because I think it's helpful to see how not every calling is to ministry as a pastor. God uses people for his purposes in a variety of ways. So Jason met me and I was already a pastor, and he had to deal with um okay, we're going to move a lot. Well, that's not really what the life I planned for myself was. And um uh the year that I was ordained, which was 2017, ordination was in June and I had been in the beginning of August. So I was very pregnant during that annual conference up in Bismarck, and it was like 100 degrees. I'm not exaggerating that it was 100 degrees in June in Bismarck that year. To me, it felt like much more. So I was kind of physically miserable that week. And if you've been pregnant before, you understand how pregnancy not only affects your physical body, but your emotions and all of the things. And then ordination on top of it is such a big holy moment in the life of anybody who goes through that. And so I had the night of ordination in that service. I had a lot of things coursing through me, right? I had um the holy moments of the bishop laid hands on me. I also had the frustrating moments of I can't bend down and put my shoes on because I've got this giant belly in the way, and I can't wear the shoes I want to wear because I'm retaining water, and I have kegels because of this pregnancy. And so, I felt like already I was holding on by a thread, just keeping myself together. And during the ordination service, they have a time where they invite people to come forward who maybe are feeling a call from God in some way and what that might look like. And then they can come forward and be prayed over by clergy, and we can help kind of initiate what that discernment process will look like for them. That's part of the work that I do now. But that night, I had just been ordained. I'm wearing my stole for the first time. And they're going through that part, and someone nudges me and said, Jason's coming down. And I was like, no, what? Sure enough, my husband was coming forward, and I had the moment of like, is he going to be a pastor? Like, I've never in my life believed that Jason's calling was to be a pastor, but I also had moments in my life that I didn't think that that was my calling. So I've been wrong before. And he came down, and so I went, I'm going to get choked up talking about this. So I went, and what he said, it still just means so much to me that he felt called by God to be my partner in ministry, that he understood that night that his role was to be able to make my ministry possible. And he's done that. That was right before our first child was born, and I think Jason began to understand what it would take to be a partner to a pastor. And he began to understand the roles that he would need to take on in order to make all of this work. And that's what you've seen. And so many of you have commented on how wonderful of a father he is, on, like the fact that his job works for me to be itinerant. These are all intentional things that have come out of what he understands his calling to be, that it is part of what we do together. That his calling really is to take on those other things, to free, so that when I'm doing ministry, I can do ministry, and I know that he has those things under control, and that is his service to God. And it's an Ananias moment, right? Ananias is the one who made it possible for Paul to be able to go and spread the word and to do that work. You know, it is needed, and it is vital, and it is a calling. I just had in my mind my grandpa and my grandma on my mom's side. My grandfather was a mortician. He was the local funeral director in my hometown for many years. And he was incredibly outgoing. He was always like the life of the party. He was the one who everybody knew, everybody loved. Always had a joke, always had stories to tell. And my grandmother was much quieter. She was more the kind of behind the scenes, make things happen. She she uh she loved him, and she I think probably was his biggest fan, right? But um for their 50th wedding anniversary, um I remember my grandpa wanting the song Wind Beneath My Wings by Bette Midler, because he said that that's what it was like, that um she's the one that made it possible. She's the one that allowed him to be able to be that and do that for people, and to, being a funeral director is like being a pastor where your schedule is wonky, and you really need a partner that is with you in that. And she was. And she wasn't the public face, but she was the one who, without her, it wouldn't have happened. And I very much feel that way, that Jason's role isn't the public facing role. He doesn't want that role. I mean, there's some days where I don't want that role, but um, I couldn't be in the role I'm in without him. So again, sometimes our calling is, you know, a lifetime of service in a really public way or a really specific way. And sometimes our calling is very specific and maybe not as flashy, but no less vital and important in the life of the church, in the life of people. And so All of this to say is that each one of you, that God is calling you in some way. Each one of you have been asked, have been invited by Jesus into something. Your job is to be willing to see it and to be willing to embrace it and to be willing to do it. It might mean that there are people that won't understand, that won't have the same values as you have, but there also will be people who do. People who are aligned with God's will and God's purposes, who will welcome you and be gracious and be supportive in ways that you would never imagine. And so that's what we talked about in confirmation this week. It was a pretty good lesson. I think it's a good lesson for all of us, especially as we are in this season of Lent and discernment and, maybe even repentance for the ways in which we've avoided God's call, which, I'm certainly one of those people who spent many years trying to do things my own way before giving in and realizing that God had a much better way for me. And I hope you come to know that as well. So until next time, God bless. Thank you for joining us for this episode of What's Going On, a video and audio podcast of First United Methodist Church in Yankton, South Dakota. We'd love to have you join us for worship on Sundays at 10 a.m., either in person or via our live stream, which can be found at our website, www.firstumcyankton.org, or by searching First UMC Yankton on YouTube.